Good Lord, the chat's already filling up this morning. Well, let's do us a show, y'all. All right, good morning. And to answer your question, Waller, no, I do not have a hype routine that I go through in the morning before each show. I just wake up and be awesome. I was actually on the phone with Cameron this morning, right up until literally the minute I pushed the go button to let the show get started. So Waller says Stuart Smalley has entered the chat because you're good enough, smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like you. And that's, you know what? I can work with that. So this morning it's Firearms Friday, and I've got a story that I want to cover. In fact, I've got a couple stories I want to cover because that's what we do on Firearms Friday. And we're going to start with this one. It didn't do the thing. Button. There we go. Praying at home may be a criminal offense in Scotland under a new law. Praying at home may be a criminal offense in Scotland under a new law. There we go. Demonstrators hold an abortion clinic buffer zone protest outside the Scottish Parliament on September 24th, 2024 in Edinburgh, Scotland. A new law in Scotland bans protesters from gathering within 200 meters of clinics where abortions are carried out. The anti-abortion group Society for the Protection of Unborn Children has organized protests against the measure. Scotland has enacted new abortion legislation that could criminalize praying at home within the designated zones. The Abortion Services Act of 2024 could result in prosecution for activities conducted in their own homes if these actions cause harassment, alarm, or distress to staff and patients at abortion clinics. Basically, if you live within 200 meters of an abortion clinic, is that right? Was it within 200 meters of an abortion clinic, so quarter of a kilometer ish, which is not a particularly small area. 200 meters is actually a pretty reasonably impressive shot with iron sights, for example. You can't wear a t-shirt that has pro-life messaging on it, stuff like that. You cannot be perceived to be in opposition to abortion in your own home under Scottish law. Now, I want you to understand that what's especially alarming about this is the rest of the UK, England, and Wales are already telegraphing that they will be passing similar legislation next year. But Lowry, hey fat boy, what does this have to do with firearms on a Firearms Friday? That is an excellent question. I have many times described before that your average citizen of the world, your average human being, perceives the world when thinking, especially American citizens, perceives the world when thinking about America and seeing things like this happen. They think that America is the last bastion of freedom. like the world was free, and then psychopathy, communism, and tyranny kind of are taking over and closing in on us. But that's not what happened. That is not how it happened. Okay? We are not the last bastion of freedom. We are the first footfall, the beachhead. The state of the world was tyranny, monarchy, autarky, and feudalism. And to a lesser extent, tribal infighting and internecine warfare. Until America became reality. Liberty occurred here and has attempted slowly over the last not quite 300 years to push its way out and free people around the world, to abolish slavery, to introduce the idea of free speech, right? To fund scientific endeavor globally. America is the first footfall, the beachhead of liberty. And we are beset on all sides by enemies who seek to destroy us. By governments and multinational corporations who despise the freedom that you have. So, laws like that, essentially creating thought crime, are happening. They're happening outside of the US, but you've got people like Kamala Harris and Tim Walz who have said things like, the First Amendment doesn't protect your right to say things that offend people. The First Amendment doesn't protect hate speech. Yes, it does. Because hate speech is never more clearly defined than speech that I dislike because I find it objectionable. The sort of people who believe that hate speech is a reasonable legal concept will also tell you that the statement "you shouldn't murder babies" is an utterance of hate speech. So what does this have to do with guns? Life without the Second Amendment. New Zealand gun owners disarmed for thought crimes. Now, both of these articles, the one that I just read and this one that I just brought up, are from within the last week. It was actually Liberty Doll that turned me onto this one. If you guys aren't watching Liberty Doll already, go check her out and give her a sub, because she does a great job of covering Second Amendment news. Good, very, very good content creator. So Liberty Doll on YouTube and wherever, go check her out. Follow her on X. So 62 New Zealand gun owners had their firearm licenses revoked, not for anything they said or did, but for what they allegedly believed. The 62 licensees must now surrender their firearms. None were ever charged with a crime. Instead, the New Zealand government officials have accused them and more than 1,000 others who didn't own firearms of being under the influence of sovereign citizen ideologies, which stress the illegitimacy of the national government. So if you're not familiar with the sovereign citizen movement, it's kind of a goofy movement that operates under the presupposition that all maritime law essentially predates and therefore supersedes all other law. And so your national governmental laws are not legitimate because the maritime law describes the way that conduct is supposed to be done, and so your driver's licenses are illegitimate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The sovereign citizens, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with their ideology, because frankly, you don't see a lot of real sharp sovereign citizen characters. But my opinion of sovereign citizens generally isn't especially relevant to the content of this article. Because the broader point is that New Zealand, a government which is composed largely of the same sorts of people as a Kamala Harris or Tim Walz or Joe Biden, these sociopaths who are all into the whole New World Order, Bilderberg, frickin' Soros-funded psychopathy. These people were accused of not being sovereign citizens, mind you. The quote from the government is of being under the influence of sovereign citizen ideologies. These types of anti-government beliefs, according to the New Zealand newspaper Waikato Times, violate the fit and proper person clause as defined by New Zealand law, which is a requirement for anyone who applies for or possesses a firearm license. So this is, excuse me. So we're talking about the government saying, rather than you have a right to keep and bear arms, like we have in the United States, in theory, that the government determines whether or not you have a right to keep and bear arms. In fact, they don't even determine whether or not you have a right. What they do is they determine whether or not they want you to have a gun, and then they give you one. So, one of the key reasons that the Second Amendment is so important, imagine a world where the government determines whether or not you can have a firearm. And then ask yourself, is there a place in that world where there can exist a law-abiding citizen who, as the founders intended, is capable of joining a militia for the purpose of abolishing the government and forming new government? See, because that is the American argument, is that whenever a government becomes corrupt and destructive to those ends which are liberty, prosperity of the people of that government, then it is incumbent, it is the responsibility of the people to abolish that government and form new government. Now imagine that trying to happen in a world where that government has the authority to determine who is and is not armed. And what you have is a world where the corrupt government arms only those people, specifically arms those people who support that corruption. Now, to a lesser extent, you can talk about driver's license, medical license, legal licenses, name your license. And it is the same kind of corruption. But when you start talking about licensing the possession of firearms, you're talking about commanding the conduct of an entire people. That is the complete and total abolition of liberty and prosperity. So today it's you cannot in the privacy of your own home disdain infanticide. And tomorrow, we're knocking on your door to ask you if you've seen the pew pew. That's the absolute state of the world right now. And Kamala Harris, who is on track to be defeated on Tuesday, God willing, has absolutely said, I am coming for your guns. She started to backtrack over the last couple of weeks. Oh, I'm a gun owner myself. I've got a gun. Oh, what kind? It's a Glock. Okay. That's, yeah. Yeah, you've heard of a Glock. Excuse me. Yeah, it's a Glock. 9.17, 9mm, 45. I bet it has pink handguards, doesn't it, sweetheart? Yeah. So, yeah, if you haven't voted yet, get your ass out there and take care of business. Pit Danny says, a big Glock? I bet you it's a black Glock. So, yeah, that's what's going on in the world today. the British, the Scottish. Like, oh, we just had the Highland Games. I've got a long ancestry of Scottish blood, and we had the Highland Games. And you know what happens at the Highland Games? We drink scotch and talk about vote for Donald Trump. That's what we did that weekend, 2 weeks ago. But Scotland, like most of Europe, is just, I mean, the woke, the socialism has infected them. Sergeant Major asks, and reasonably, okay, yeah. So His Majesty asks, New Zealand has a population of 5.5 million people. That's half of the state of Georgia. Why do we treat them like they matter? Okay. I would generally agree that they don't matter in that way. However, this is kind of like looking at, it's kind of like reading the tea leaves in California legislation, right? What happens in these tiny little, it's a little laboratory of communism. They're going to try it in a tiny little nation like New Zealand and see if they get away with it. And then they'll try something like this in other places in Europe. Australia will probably try something like this. Australia will probably start with the you can't pray near an abortion clinic and then move on to the, oh, by the way, you can't have a slingshot anymore because your parents weren't Aborigine enough. So they'll toy with those things, and then eventually the UN will point and say, hey, look how good it worked over there. And we'll all be like, what do you mean how good it worked over there? Well, nobody ever gets shot. Oh, well, that's interesting. That's interesting. How many people get stabbed? You can't just abolish crime. Right? You ever been bit by a declawed cat? So, that's the only reason that we treat them like they matter. Is they matter in the sense, Dad, that we can look at what's happening there and we can kind of read the tea leaves and see what will eventually come to Canada, and through Canada become an argument for something that American politicians try to sell to the non-tax-paying lower half of American citizens. And non-citizens, because hell, let's just let them vote now too. Because that's a thing that's on the ballot currently, is whether or not we elect an administration that goes out of their way to increase the number of non-citizens voting. Sergeant Major says the UN is not our friend. I would go a step further than that. If I had my way, we would abolish the UN and NATO. Actually, we wouldn't abolish them. If I had my way, we would withdraw. We would just no longer fund NATO or the UN. That would essentially be the same as abolishing them. They would no longer be able to operate without our direct funding. But excuse me. But that's kind of where we're at. I would love to see NATO and the UN both just gone. Okay. Now, so I wanted to cover those stories. Let me change a couple things on the screen here. And here we go. Concealed carrier arrested after shooting man who reportedly hit him in the face with a glass jar in Chicago. Okay, Chicago concealed license holder used his firearm in self-defense Monday afternoon outside the Loyola Red Line station after being struck in the face by a glass jar during an altercation. The incident unfolded on the 1200 block of West Loyola Avenue, where Chicago police stated that the three men were initially approached by a fourth who reportedly pulled a firearm and fired, injuring two individuals. 28-year-old man in the hand and a 24-year-old man in the arm. Both injured men are reportedly in good condition. Oh, y'all know what that means. Somebody needs to go back to the range. Afterward, the concealed carry holder was taken into custody by Chicago Police Department officers, but more details soon emerged. Local Alderman Maria Hayden, 49th Ward, shared a different version of events on social media, stating that the situation initially involved only two men. An argument broke out between the two individuals, leading one to throw a glass jar at the concealed carry license holder, hitting him in the face. In response, the man who was struck, reportedly licensed to carry, drew his firearm and fired at the attacker. Hayden's account further indicated that one of the men injured did not sustain gunshot wounds, contradicting earlier reports. Instead, she clarified that the injury to the individual's hand resulted from contact with a fence, not from a bullet. This is my least favorite kind of story. Pitt Danny correctly points out that a glass jar is a deadly weapon. Yes, it is. There are very few things that a grown man can put his hands on which cannot become a deadly weapon. Heavy wrench, a not so heavy wrench, a screwdriver, a tape dispenser. You know, it doesn't even have to be especially heavy. Just motivated. And just about anything you put your hands on becomes a deadly weapon. And that is something that can be argued in court, absolutely. So, I will go so far, though, in this case, case by case, I'd have to have been there and seen what actually happened. Did the guy throw a glass jar, hit him in the face, and then reach for another weapon? But, me, I'm going to go to my firearm if there's a weapon. If the opponent has a weapon involved, I'm probably going to go to my firearm pretty quickly. Because once you have a motivated attacker, especially one who's sufficiently motivated that they're grabbing hard objects to use as improvised projectiles. Now you're talking about somebody who has intent. Somebody who means to cause you great bodily harm if they can get away with it. And that is sufficient, in my book, to defend yourself. Right? That said, it sounds like they were arguing with each other to begin with. And I will go so far as to say that de-escalation is a skill that everybody should be cultivating to avoid a situation like this generally. Now, probably the best thing you can do to avoid situations like this is it's not even all that hard. It may be expensive and time consuming, but probably the number one predictor of whether or not you're likely to be the victim of a violent crime is, do you live in a city run by Democrats? Because if you live in a city run by Democrats and spend all your time in a city run by Democrats, then you have an almost statistical guarantee of being a victim of serious violent crime at some point in your life, at least as compared to any other place in the world. Right? Move out of the city, even if it's just to the suburbs. Get out of the damn city. It's full of people that throw glass jars and shit on the street. Right? The city is full of assholes and drugs and human feces. And yes, I mean every city. Atlanta is only slightly less shitty than San Francisco or Los Angeles. Because our bums tend to shit under the overpasses and not right in the doorway at your local businesses. But they're still there. Get the hell away from the cities, guys. They're not good for you. Okay. So, it was Halloween yesterday. I hope everybody had a good time, did some trick-or-treating. I know my kids actually managed to get their hands on quite a bit of candy. Mom and Dad, we came home last night after having dinner with y'all and Patrick at the farm last night. When we got home, they were still out in the little old town square with the tent set up and trick-or-treating, and Fee took the kids up there and they all got loaded up on candy. So they had a great Halloween. And going into the weekend, it is the weekend after Halloween, and we are going into the weekend before an election, which the weekend after Halloween is the weekend before an election every election year. I don't know what's going to happen yet, guys. I expect to see some noise this weekend. I expect we're going to see protests. I don't expect that we're going to see riots necessarily this weekend, but do yourselves a favor. If you live in a shitty city like Atlanta or Chicago or San Francisco or New York, maybe get you an Airbnb this weekend. Get the hell out. Get to safety. Because Democrats are like Spanish soccer fans. They don't care if they win or lose. They just want to burn your shit. Now, the election is Tuesday. And we're already being told that they're going to steal the election by refusing to finish counting on Tuesday. Next week is going to be interesting. Y'all might want to go to Walmart. Get you some groceries in today. And plan on sitting at home and kind of waiting for it to blow over. Because the next week or two are going to be... They're going to be interesting. We're going to hear a lot of lies. We're going to hear a lot of accusations. And I would be surprised if we don't see some serious violence. No matter who wins. Because Democrats are violent creatures. And so they will go out and they will do the violence. That's what they do. So, y'all be safe out there. Don't drive drunk. Don't fry bacon naked. We love you, and we will see you on Monday.